Hi everyone, this is BritSimon. We need to continue the series of videos that I'm creating for analysis of each of the regions in DV2024. I'm going to do Asia next. I'm going to tackle Asia. Asia is quite complicated in a way. It's simple in some ways and it's complex in another, right? And I'm going to explain that for you. So I suggest go and get a cup of tea or something and sit down and have some patience because this video, I don't have a script, but this video could take a little while to go through for me to explain the things that I'm thinking about, right? And you know, if you only want to get to the sort of the immediate answer, because I did have someone post on my Africa video yesterday, get straight to the point. Well, I'm sorry, but for people that think like that, I'm not going to help them. I'm going to give you information. I'm going to try and make clear that predictions are only projections or predictions. You can't possibly be certain about something like this, you know, months before it's actually happened. And so I ask that you be sort of fairly open-minded, adult in nature, think about what I'm saying and try and understand what I'm trying to put across to you. I will make some statements about predictions and projections in this video. But again, you are free to believe what you want to believe. You're free to ignore my projections and believe in whatever you want to believe. But I'm just trying to give the information, as hard as that may be at times, because sometimes your emotions get in the way of your logic, and that's understandable. I've been where you are. I was a DV lottery derivative. My wife was the winner. I know what it's like to go through this process. I know what it's like to have a high case number. In an oversubscribed year. My year had 140,000 selectees. And so I know exactly how it is for DV 2024 folks who are in an overselected year, right? So I hope you will give me some patience, give me some space to try and explain as best I know how. Okay. All right. So let's start off with having a look at the data. And let me pull this across. Yeah, so we're going to have a look at the 24 data, and let me show you my screen. Let me put me down there. Yeah. Okay, so this is the 24 data, and we're going to be talking about Asia exclusively. We're not going to be talking about Africa. I did that yesterday. We're not going to be talking about EU. I'm going to try and do that tomorrow. And EU is complex still. Oceania and South America are very easy to talk through, and so I'll probably do both of those in one night, in one sitting. And maybe EU tomorrow, and then Oceania and South America the day after that, something like that. I'm doing the best I can with pretty heavy work commitments as well. So here we go. This is the CEAC data now. If we have a look at the shape, first of all, the distribution pattern of the cases, this is important to understand. We can see, if you haven't already heard my explanations, we can see that there is a cutoff, or cliff as I call it, at about 13,000. And that's basically because of Nepal cases. They cut off at that point. And then Iran goes up to 22,000. And cuts off at that point, and then all the other countries continue until the end, until 44,000, or just about 44,000, right? So I tried to gather information before we had the CEAC data about highest case numbers, and I was given some idea that there was a higher case number than actually we can see here, or there were higher case numbers. So things are not as bad as the 54 or 55,000 we thought, in a sense, in terms of case numbers. But the case numbers are kind of irrelevant. You have to get the case numbers out of your head. because really it's about how many cases per thousand, what's the density, how many cases there are overall. It's not about your case number. That's just positional, where you belong in the queue. What's important is to know how many cases there are before you, how many are after you, etc. That kind of makes much more sense to look at it that way rather than obsessing about what case number you're at. Okay, now you can see this blue color. The blue color is holes. Right now, again, holes, just in case you don't know, is cases that are disqualified during the draw process. So before the results are even announced, those cases are disqualified for things like incorrect photos, duplicate entries, that sort of thing. And so those cases, although the random draw process selected a case number and put it at case number, I don't know, AS3 or something, Asia number 3, that case was then disqualified and now is a hole, right? And that's what holes are. And you can see there's a lot of blue color. That means there's a lot of holes, right? Now, if we go back to a spreadsheet that you should have seen, there's a couple of spreadsheets I want to show you here. So it's going to take me a moment to get the right one. Case number analysis, this one, yeah. So if we go back to my analysis here, we can see a few things that I projected, etc. But what I want to show you here is the different. There's a couple of key points on here. In DV 2023, there were 24,000 selectees. In DV 2024 in Asia, there are almost 28,000. In 23, the case density was 47%. That means that there was 53% or 52.5% holes, right? And in DV 2024, there are 33% cases which are not holes, right? So in other words, the holes 67%. So there is a lower density rate. So partly that explains the increased numbers. But the increased numbers we're seeing up to 44,000 rather than last year's 27,500, whatever it was, is partly to do with the lower density of correct cases, more holes, and partly to do with a 16% increase in the number of selectees. Okay, so you've got to bear that sort of information in mind. And then how many cases are there? Well, I had projected that there was going to be 14,400 cases. In fact, there's just under 14,000, right? And so, you know, that's fine. Another interesting fact to know is that the derivative rate for Asia is about 2, exactly 2 in this year. Yeah, we now know, the highest case number is not 44,000, 43,000. So, you know, that's the highest case number we have there, right? Okay, so so we've got some good data to work off. That's important, and if we just look at the distribution of cases, this is something I want to show you as well. And let me make this a little bit bigger. Yeah, and I'm going to scroll down and across so I can make this picture a little bit clearer. Some of you may have seen my video some weeks ago where I explained how the distribution graph on Zarthesius's website would look. And I put some numbers together and I created a chart, and now this chart is the representation, the actual data that's represented here. And so you can see what I've created here is an understanding of the cliff that happens at 13,000, just below 13,000, the cliff that comes along at 22,000, and then it carries on all the way up to, actually it should be 43,000, not 44,000. I'll go and correct that now. Let's just delete that out. Now, the other thing that's going to be important is that you understand how this happens, right? And so I've colored the different countries in this chart. So this blue color here is Nepalese cases. The orangey sort of color is Iranian cases. and the rest of Asia, which is every other country in Asia, all combined, is this sort of yellow color, right? And so if we look at that chart and we say, okay, how many cases from each of the countries or ROA are in each 1,000 cases, then we can see that there should be about 184 cases on average for every 1,000 cases from Nepal, which is this blue color here, right? Going up to 13,000. Then there should be 122 cases from Iran in every 1,000 cases, roughly. And there would be 202 cases combined for the rest of Asia. Okay, that's important to understand those distributions because you'll get the idea later. But as I come to the point when we're talking about countries, you'll understand that the rest of Asia and Nepal and Iran is basically like 3 different competing horses in the same race, and we have to think of it that way. Okay, and so how many cases there are per 1,000 from each of those horses is kind of important. Okay, so again, just load up this information in your head, and we'll come back to it if we need to as I go through. Okay, so let's talk about a projection. Now, the projection that I gave for Africa took essentially took the number of cases that were scheduled in DV 2023 and then looked for the case number that corresponds with that number of cases. So I think just from memory, I think it was something like 14,600 cases which were scheduled for Africa in DV 2023. And then when we look at those cases, we know that those cases, we have to take out the allowance of cases that never even apply. They don't submit the DS-260. Then we have to figure out how many people are going to be refused, how many people are going to go on 221G, how many people are going to be basically, not show up for their interview or have their interview cancelled, so they stay unready. And we can see that data actually if we look at 24 data. Let's just switch over to 24 data for a second. Sorry, not 24 data, 23. Let me look at that. Okay, so the 15,461. Sorry, I think I said 14,000. That's the number of cases that Africa had, and 6206 is the number of scheduled cases for Asia in DV 2023. But there's a couple of things I want to point out to you about Asia in 2023. Number one, the region didn't go current. It was cut off at 21,000. The highest case number was nearly 28,000. And so there was about, I'm going to say 20% of cases that never got current. It's a little bit less than 20%, but I'll say 20%, right? And as you can see, there were 9,600 visas issued for DV 2023 out of 4,874 cases. So 6,200 cases were scheduled and nearly 4,900 cases were approved. So from that, you can kind of get the idea that not every case gets approved, right? There are going to be refusals. There's going to be 221Gs. There's going to be cases of no-shows. And in DV 2023, there were also some of those interviews were cancelled at the last minute, right? Now, the other critical fact about Asia in DV 2023 that you've got to understand is that the quota was exceeded by 1,000 visas. The quota for Asia is 8,500 visas, right? The reason that Asia was able to exceed the quota was because Africa undershot its quota, underused its quota. And the African unused quota was redistributed to the other regions, all of them. So EU got a little bit more than they should have got, right? More than their quota. OC, funnily enough, didn't. And I'll be talking about that in a couple of days' time. And South America got a little bit more than their quota. Okay. So Asia did very well in using some of the unused quota from Africa. If Africa does well this year, then that that additional number of visas won't be available for Asia. Okay, and Africa may do better this year, considering Nairobi embassy is performing better. We've still got problems with a couple of the embassies in Africa, Cairo, for example, Addis Ababa, Accra. Those embassies are giving us some heartburn at the moment. But in general, Africa should perform a little bit better than they did in DV 2023. So I don't really want to project that Asia will be able to take as many visas in DV 2024 as it took in DV 2023. I'd like to try and keep it to about 9,000 in terms of thinking what the quota and extras will be, right? So 9,000 visas is kind of my target. I could be surprised one way or the other about that. It could be less, it could be more than that. And that will obviously have an effect that we need to calculate and we need to think about later. And that creates some uncertainty with the predictions, with not knowing precisely where we're going to end up. So what happens in Africa, although you think it doesn't matter to Asia, it kind of does, right? Because a good year for Africa will reduce the number of available visas for Asia, because the extra unused visas won't be there. It'll only have its own quota of 8,500 or so. Okay, so so that's important to understand. All of that DV 2024 data is important to understand. You also, let's have a look at Zarthisius, the 24, let's have a look at the 24 data again. We'll just have that up here. And we'll make sure that we can come back to that if we need to. We can see how many have been scheduled so far, etc. And they're doing pretty good so far in the first 5 months of scheduling. And 803 visas have been issued already. Okay, so so that's good. Hopefully you're keeping pace with all of that. Now, we then need to think about embassy performance on a country by country basis. How are the countries going to perform? And I've done a little bit of pivoting on the data that's available from Zarthisius, and I've figured out how many interviews have been scheduled at each embassy and I've chosen the Asia region. Okay, and there's some interesting data from there. Now, Nepal, let's just have a look at Nepal, Kathmandu. Yeah, Nepal has had 580 interviews scheduled up until the end of February, right? So so Nepal is going to do fine, right? Nobody in Nepal needs to worry. I can actually just say right now, Nepal is going to go current. You know, every case in Nepal will go current. And Nepal will probably have a very high rate of success, as they did last year, and I'll show you that in a moment. And we'll probably see 3,500 visas issued for Nepal, roughly speaking, right? The next biggest country is Iran, and Iran is, Iranians are typically interviewed either at Abu Dhabi, which has got 164 Asian applicants already scheduled up until the end of February. Ankara, which has got 214 Asian applicants scheduled up until the end of February, and Yerevan, right, which has got only 55. Yerevan is typically a little bit smaller than the other two. Now, interestingly, Ankara at 214 is a pretty good number of scheduled interviews, and those are almost exclusively Iranians at Ankara, because obviously Ankara is part of the EU region. So there will be additional numbers of people at Ankara who are locals, right? Abu Dhabi is mixed in with the locals, and so we can't say that all of that 164 are for Nepal. And then for Yerevan, we can say again fairly reliably, most, you know, probably 95% of those are Iranian cases scheduled at Iran. So I would say that so far, Iran is doing kind of okay at those three embassies. It's got three embassies that cases are allocated to, and they tend to, you know, it's fairly good that they've got to where they've got to, at least in Ankara at this point. So I'm kind of intrigued by that. The rest of the region has one other pleasant surprise, which is Islamabad. Now, Islamabad is an important embassy for Afghans. Many of the Afghan cases, because of course their local embassy is closed now, many of the Afghan cases can travel with reasonable ease, or I'm not quite sure it's total ease in Afghanistan at the moment, thanks to the new government there. But let's say with reasonable ease, they can travel to Pakistan. They can communicate well. The culture suits them. It's fairly comfortable for them to wait there. And again, it's no cakewalk. I'm not trying to minimize the hardships on Afghans, but Afghans can ask for their case to be moved to any embassy they want, right? And Pakistan is an easy embassy for them to travel to, relatively speaking, right? Easier than some other embassies. So it's nice to see that Islamabad is scheduling fairly well, 143, who will mostly be from Afghanistan, I'm guessing. All right, so we'll keep an eye on that. But we're starting to sort of shape up reasonably well. We see a couple of other embassies that are, starting to get decent numbers, but nothing sort of too bad or too good stands out apart from the ones I've mentioned in terms of embassy performance. Okay, now let's look at the projection sheet again. The way that I did the projection for Africa was a little bit similar to this. I took the number of cases that have been scheduled. I added a number for non-response, and that told me that the bare minimum of cases that we would need would be 6,826. And the case number that relates to 1626 is 13,712. But to me, that's way too low a number. And it doesn't really make sense. I don't think this particular method works very well for Asia. Okay, so I'm going to disregard this whole method. It's just not a good method to use for Asia, and I'll explain why a little bit. So instead, we look at where is the quota going to be used in Asia. And you can assume this sort of chart right here will be the case. Nepal will take 3,500 of the 9,000 visas, roughly. Iran may take, let's say, 1,500. I've increased that over last year's number, which was 1,103. I've increased that because I'm hopeful that Iranians will understand how to get their cases interviewed, will get better cooperation from the three embassies that we just talked about, and hopefully they'll be scheduled early enough in the year that they can actually process their cases. So we could see as many as 1,500 being issued for Iran. Now, bearing in mind 5,000 selectees for Iran, so to say 1,500 get issued, that's still a horrific situation. In one sense, it gives people what about 40% chance of actually, getting 40%, no, 30%, 30% chance of actually getting their visa from an Iranian case. So that's no cakewalk either. I mean, that's not going to be fun. But we're just sort of putting together some numbers here, right? So Nepal and Iran will get those sort of numbers, and that will leave about 4,000 visas for the rest of Asia. All right, and the rest of Asia will share those 4,000 visas. That's roughly how things will work in Asia. And so, since we know that those three horses in that particular race, Nepal, Iran, and the rest of Asia, we can kind of back into the numbers and try and figure out how the countries will get their distribution of visas, etc., how things will work. And we can do that looking historically on what happened last year. My dog's going nuts, so I'm sorry if you can hear her doing that. So let's just talk about the per country number of selectees and their performance last year, and therefore why I'm making the estimations I'm making for this year. So I've taken the top sort of, what's that, top 9 or 10 countries, the largest countries in terms of number of selectees. I don't feel the need to go down to the smaller countries because, you know, it's not going to add a great deal. But so I've got almost, of the 24 selectees, I have just over 25,251. So I'm short of about 2,500 selectees, maybe a little bit more than 2,500 selectees, which are selectees at other countries other than ones I've listed here, okay? Also in the rest of Asia. But those will produce visas as well, but I just didn't want to gather the data at such a sort of a low level of detail for countries that have relatively small number of selectees. Okay, so in 23, there were 3,808 selectees in Nepal, and they got almost 3,400. Their percentage of issuance, sort of for every case that is selected, how many do they get issued? They're the highest in the whole region, obviously, at 89%. They have an amazing embassy. They get very high rates of approval. They've got a couple of agencies there that I think help people through. So Nepalese tend to get, you know, a sort of a very good number. This year, their number of selectees has increased by about 150. And I felt confident then in increasing the number of visas that would be issued to Nepal to 3,500. That's how I've got to that number of 3,500, right? If we look at Iran, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, that they're spread amongst three embassies, etc., and they have a hard time in getting processed. They also have, by the way, very long periods of post-interview background checking, often lasting 4 to 5 months, which means for Iranian cases, if they haven't been scheduled before about May or June, then they're really at high risk of not having enough time to be processed before the end of the year. So the reality is that most Iranian cases that are issued will come from the first sort of 8 to 10 months at most. And then any Iranian cases that are scheduled in July, August, and September are automatically at risk because of that post-interview background checking, right? So, you know, Iranians really need to understand that point, because if you're an Iranian, particularly an Iranian male, and you're being scheduled for an interview in August or September, chances are you're going to lose your money and not get your visa. That's the reality of it. Not 100% certain that will be the case in your case, but that is much more likely than not, right? And that's why we see only 30% of cases getting issued, which is, you know, it's crazy. Okay, so if we look at DV 2023 performance, there were 5,500 Iranian selectees and 1,103, or about 20%, got their visas issued. For Nepal and Iran, all of the cases in those countries went current, right? And so with 100% current for those two countries, they got 89% and 20%. Massive difference between those two, obviously. And so I am somewhat optimistically saying that Iran could do better this year. I'm hoping they would do better for their own sake, obviously. But between those first two countries, we have accounted for 5,000 of, let's say, the 9,000 visas that I expect to be issued in DV 2024, right? That's my guesstimate for those two. So where are the next 4,000 coming from? Now we get to these other countries, right? And we start to look at, again, for Afghanistan, Yemen, Sri Lanka, and so on, we start to look at their 23 selectee count and how many they got issued from that year. But for these percentages, I've added a factor because only 80% of the cases, not even quite 80%, of the cases became current, right? So that means that of the 2,700 people in Afghanistan, there were probably 500 or so cases that didn't get current. So I've increased these percentage of success rates a little bit from a straight percentage on the number of issued to the number of selectees in 23. I've increased it by a factor of 1.2, and I've done the same thing for all of these countries because those countries only had nearly 80% of their numbers current, right? The region cut off at 21,000, and actually numbers carried on until nearly 28,000. Okay. So in this year, we have 4,500 selectees for Afghanistan, 3,485 for Yemen, and so on. Now, if we talk about some of these countries for a moment, before I give you the projections and my rationale for the projections, Afghanistan, we just talked about, it's a homeless group of people in terms of the embassy. That when a country doesn't have availability of its embassy, the US embassy in that country, it's classified as a homeless embassy. And Afghanistan is a de facto homeless embassy. So there is a special allowance made for Afghans, which says that they can apply to be scheduled at any embassy they want. They simply have to email KCC, and they will be allocated to another embassy. There was a lawsuit that caused that. I think it was Curtis Morrison's lawsuit that caused that. I'm not sure, it might have been someone else's, but it was part of a lawsuit agreement that Afghans would have that ability while they were disadvantaged by the embassy closure. So there's 4,536 Afghans throughout the whole range, right? Yemen, another homeless embassy, and Yemenis go to, where do Yemenis go to? Hang on a second. Yemenis go to Djibouti, right? So so the Yemenis who are suffering and have been suffering for years with troubles at home, they have to make the journey to another embassy because their own embassy is not available to them. And so, that represents a risk for Yemeni cases. And that's one of the reasons why their number is so low, right? And same sort of thing for Syrians, by the way. They're going to be interviewed in Beirut. But it's a relatively small country in terms of the number of selectees, so I haven't really looked at that too much in depth. But you can see there's some other, Syrians can also go to Oman. But you can see that there is a sort of a homeless embassy sort of allocation apart from Afghanistan, which, as I say, can go anywhere, right? Afghanistan, and they generally go to Islamabad, just for the reasons we talked about earlier. Okay, so as we go through these countries, you can see there are some countries which are going through difficult times for political or reasons of war or embassy closures and that sort of thing. And so these real sort of high number of selectees in DV 2024 are going to end up with not many, or not so many issued visas, right? Partly because they can't travel, and not many of them will be able to travel, not all of them. So okay, so that's my list of countries and selectees, and showing you what I think could happen. Right now, this is my projection in terms of the number of visas that I think would be allocated to each of these countries at a 50% current number. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I've had to back into what number I think will go current and test against that to see if that makes sense to create the 4,000 visas. So fairly randomly, I picked a number just with a little bit of a sort of a guesstimate, a gut reaction based on some knowledge, etc., and said, okay, of the 43,000 case, we've got cases up to nearly 43,000. How about we pretty much halve that? How about we say there's going to be up to 22,000 will go current? just to test the theory, right? And so that would mean that of the 4,536 Afghans, for example, half of them only would go current. Half of the Yemenis would go current, and so on, right? That's at 22,000, roughly, or just under 22,000. So in that case, and using the projection of success rate that we have from DV2023 numbers, I've calculated with a formula here saying half of the selectees will go current, right? I've said selectees multiplied by 0.5 and then multiplied by the percentage of success rate based on the 23 data that we've got, right? And that gives us some numbers here of selectees that will turn into issuances per country, okay? And if I do that, and then and I've done that for each of the countries, and bear in mind, there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of thousand selectees that I haven't got in this list. But if I just do that and total that up, I get 8,560. Okay, and from the other 2,000, which are the remaining selectees in the region, we would certainly get another 500 selectees from there. In other words, this number is enough to meet the quota, and that's at 22,000 current, right? Some number actually slightly, near 22,000, probably 21,750, something around about that. Now that's a guesstimate. Okay, there's some logic in that. There's some science behind it, if you like, but it is just a guesstimate. But I wanted to test the theory, and it just happened that I tested the theory at a factor of 0.5. Half of the selectees get current, and that kind of makes sense. And it's fairly optimistic in a sense, because I'm assuming that in order to issue, so 4,000 visas comes from 2,000 cases, right? So 2,000 cases being approved would give us 4,000 visas for the rest of Asia. The reason that there's 2,000 cases and 4,000 people is that derivative rate of 2. We know the derivative rate for Asia is 2. So we only need to see 2,000 cases from the rest of Asia being approved. And so I'm saying, okay, we would need at least 3,000, let's say maybe up to 4,000 cases to produce the 2,000 that would be issued. We need 3,000 to 4,000. And let's take the 4,000. Of the 4,000, roughly 400 or 500 of those 4,000 cases just wouldn't respond. Some of them would be, particularly in Iran, would not be approved. They will be on 221G for a long period of time. And the same thing will happen for, not as bad, but could happen for some of the other countries in the rest of Asia as well. And so, I feel like having 4,000 raw case numbers would yield 2,000 issued cases, or 4,000 issued visas fairly comfortably, right? And 4,000 cases needs about 20,000 case numbers in the visa bulletin, right? Case numbers up to about 20,000. Why is that? Well, if we look at our distribution here, and we look at this distribution again, for the rest of Asia, there are 202 cases per 1,000, right? So call that 20%, or 200 per 1,000. So 20,000 sets of 1,000, 20 1,000s would give us 4,000 cases. So again, it kind of supports the theory that if we went to 22,000, that's a pretty optimistic estimate, because that would actually be 4,400 cases, nearly 4,500 cases, out of which we only need 2,000 cases to be issued, right? So the danger range, if you like, for Asia starts off at around about probably 18, 19,000, maybe even 17,000, and everything between sort of, let's say, 17,000 and let's say 23, 24,000 at that range. Everything in that range is kind of, where I expect the cutoff, the final cutoff to happen, something in that range, right? Could it be 25,000? Maybe. Could it be much more than that? No, I don't think it could be much more than that. So the case is that if you've got a case number in Asia higher than 25,000, then it's probably not going to be your year. That's my estimation, because 25,000 would be over 5,000 cases, appreciably over 5,000 cases for the rest of Asia. And we only need 2,000 in order to meet the quota if Iran and Nepal behave as I've suggested, right? Could it be 17, 18,000? Well, at 17,000, that's 3,400 cases that have been revealed in the rest of Asia. Could you get 2,000 cases being approved from 3,400 cases? Yes, you probably could, but that's why I'm saying it's about the lower end of the range, right? And so if you're in that range between 17 and let's say at the high end, just to be optimistic, let's say 25,000. If you're in that range, you've got some level of risk. The risk increases as the number goes up during that range, of course. You've got some risk at 17,000, and you've got more risk at 18,000, more risk at 19 and 20,000, and so on. And by the time you get to 25,000, you've got a very, very high level of risk, almost no chance. And it almost takes some sort of dramatic event to happen to change that trajectory. And by a dramatic event, I would mean some sort of other event in the Asia region that took a large number of selectees and made them unable to process their DV win, right? So if we look back at the list of countries that we're talking about there, which is this, if we look back at this list of countries and we said, okay, what happens if in Sri Lanka there was some localized disturbance in Sri Lanka that meant the US embassy closed and there was no time to schedule those Sri Lankan cases somewhere else? That would take out 2,600 selectees, or close to it, let's say, if that happens soon. And that means that those visas would be available for other countries in the region. That's the sort of thing it would take. And it's horrible to talk that way. I don't wish that on Sri Lanka or any of the countries. I wish only peace to them. But that's the sort of event that it would take to change this projection, or the trajectory I'm talking about here. Okay? So, just to summarize at the end here, I've given a number range, which I believe to be a sensible number range, of where the danger area starts. I'm going to assume that Iran will go current for itself, and that happens at 22,000, and that's partly why I'm matching 22,000 for the rest of Asia, because it could match. It would be unlikely that the rest of Asia would cut off at, let's say, 18,000, and Iran would exceed that, right? So I think Iran, could go current, or should go current, but there is a little bit of a chance in the top the top few numbers, top 10% or so, that maybe the number cutoff comes earlier for the rest of Asia, and therefore for Iran. Nepal goes current no matter what. Nepal gets 3,500 issued visas no matter what, right? Maybe even a little bit more than that, right? But so Nepal is the lion's share of the whole of Asia, and they will go current at 13,000. They will go current for sure. There's no scenario I can think of that that they wouldn't go current. Of course, and I should say, if Nepal were to be impacted by some sort of local event in the way I was describing earlier, that would tremendously change this picture for the rest of Asia, for the whole of Asia, right? but I just don't see that happening. I mean, it's just unlikely to happen. But it would be something like, massive localized disturbances lasting a long time in Nepal, affecting Kathmandu and causing the US embassy to close immediately overnight, right? Can't imagine what that would be. We had a pandemic that did that before, but we're not expecting another pandemic. So, so understand that's the sort of level of disturbance I'm talking about there, right? So Nepal gets its 3,500. Iran gets 1,500. Let's say it gets a little bit less. Let's say it gets 1,100. That might give a little bit of hope for the rest of Asia. A few hundred more cases for the rest of Asia. Okay, and maybe that's how we get to 25,000. It could be something in that range, right? So, and then the other countries, we may see better performance for Afghans at Islamabad, for example. We could see slightly better than this sort of performance. So maybe we see more than 600 being issued. Maybe Yemen does pretty good with people traveling. I don't know. I don't quite know what the conditions are like on the ground there for people to be able to actually travel, to be able to afford to travel, to have the physical ability to travel, despite all the disturbances there. Okay. But I think I've explained that as well as I can and given you a rationale for why I think that number is going to be cut off in that sort of range there. I hope we don't see a cutoff as low as 17,000, 18,000. I'm hoping it will be a number starting with 20,000 and something, 21,000 and something, perhaps. That would be my hope, my guess. But I have to give some sort of range so that you understand there is some level of risk at 17,000. It's not as risky as 20,000, but there is some level of risk, right? Okay, so I'm hoping that will make sense to you. Let me just, for those of you that might want to screenshot this or something, let me make this a little bit bigger so that you can follow along with my math. I should probably have done that earlier. I apologize. But this is roughly how I expect the main countries in Asia to get their distribution of visas at that level, right? I should certainly have made that bigger earlier. So I do apologize for that. Okay. If you've got any questions on this, please do ask me a question either on the YouTube channel in the comments below this video, or better yet, ask me questions on my blog at BritSimonSays.com. I very much appreciate likes on the video. If you like this video, please do take a moment to press the like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel and you have notifications turned on, because as I get additional news and information about your region, I'll obviously want to pass that information on to you. And if you are in a high case number range, what can I say to you? I'm trying to give you honest information. You are free to hope. I don't want to steal your hope from you. That's not my intention at all. But I want to warn you of the risk that exists for your cases, so that you can adjust your mental thinking about this whole thing, and try and realize that there may not be the certainty of getting a green card that you perhaps thought there was going to be when you saw that amazing news that you'd been selected. Okay, so it's a harsh reality of this program that when they over-select, as they have done, selecting 28,000 people when there's only 8,500 visas available, it creates this sort of drama, this sort of disappointment. And who is supposed to miss out? The high case numbers are supposed to miss out. That's what the law says. That's how this program is supposed to work. All right. So that's the sort of the thinking that you need to come to terms with. Okay. All right, everybody. I'll call that a day. Hope that was useful to you. All right. Have a good night. Bye-bye now.